We'd like to take a moment to thank our friends at Hester & Cook for sponsoring this podcast. Hester & Cook believes there's always a moment to celebrate, and we could not agree more. They make the most beautiful tablescapes for your holiday hosting, all from paper. Yep, you gotta see it to believe it. So stop by their stores around Nashville and Franklin, or shop online for the season's best holiday decor, gifts, and specialty tabletop items. Use promo code Magnolia for 15% off your first purchase in store or online at hesterandcook.com. The American South boasts some of the oldest communities of people of Jewish faith. In the 1600s, Jewish people began settling in Charleston, South Carolina, and by the 1700s, South Carolina had the largest Jewish population in the United States. The family recipes and stories that accompany their origins and adaptations in the American South reveal the deep and storied lives of Jewish people, families, and communities across America. We are sitting down with Rachel Gordon Barnett and Lyssa Kligman Harvey, two lifelong South Carolinians, to discuss the intersection of traditional Jewish dishes with classic Southern ingredients and African American culinary traditions. Meet you at the table.
I'm Lainey.
And I'm Laura Beth. And we are Steel Magnolias. The strength of steel
With the grace of a magnolia.
We are here to have uplifting conversations about life in the South.
And we've got plenty of room at our table. So pull up a chair.
Great. Welcome, Rachel and Lyssa Lashanatova.
Very nice. Thank you, Lashanatova.
Happy New Year.
Thank you. We know that this is a really important time of year for you guys. So we just wanted to say Happy New Year to you guys.
Well, we want you to know that we also have a commonality in passions, the importance in preserving history around the dinner table. And we have discussed this with our listeners numerous times. But we're so excited to have you ladies here to give us your perspective on that topic, too.
I cannot wait to jump into your latest project. You guys have put an immense amount of work into the book that we're going to discuss today. But before we even jump into that, I'm so curious if you guys want to just lead off with, can you just talk about the importance in food in Jewish culture?
Well, we are, I like to say that I am Southern and Jewish and that food is my love language. And but I think that for Rachel and I, that really is both, comes from both of us. And this book was written because of a blog that was centered around gathering stories and histories of Columbia, South Carolina's individuals who wanted to write and contribute to our blog, Kugels and Collars, about some of their favorite recipes, about some of their favorite food memories around the table. And it's been 7 years now, and the blog continues. We gathered wonderful stories. So, Jewish people, food is of utmost importance. It's a comfort food. We gather during the holidays. We gather around the table in happy times. We gather around the table in sad times, and food and special foods accompany it. There are traditional foods, and then there are new traditional Southern foods that we've kind of begun to adopt. And I feel that for me, food is an intentional way to create a legacy. And that for my children and my grandchildren, I want to create recipes and I want them to remember, what mom has done, because honestly, that's how I came to this. I remember my grandmother and my mother cooking traditional foods around the holidays. So I don't think that is necessarily that we own, but I do think that Jewish foods have a way of culturally, marking our place in history and our place in the world.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I would even add it feels like a lot of the Jewish festivals and celebrations are all about telling the stories.
We do celebrate so many of our holidays around the table, whether it's Passover or Rosh Hashanah meals, or even Yom Kippur, where we go to synagogue and we fast for a whole day. And then in the evening, what do? We break that fast with a big meal. So food is always there.
On Saturday, it was Rosh Hashanah, and my mother used to create a beautiful luncheon, and she has extensions for her table that fit around 20 people. So, yes, ma'am, I had 20
Wow.
people at a seated dinner, and it was buffet. Everybody got up and helped themselves, but I had traditional foods of brisket and kugel. I had sweet and sour meatballs, which these are traditional foods for Rosh Hashanah. And then because we want to bring in the new year with sweet, healthy foods, maybe not so healthy, but sweet food. So we have apples and honey. We have a sweet kugel. Our brisket is sweet. Even the chicken that I made had apricots and apricot preserves in it. So
Mm.
yes, there are kind of underlying traditions. But the pomegranate is very meaningful, and it has many seeds that represent good deeds that we are supposed to do, the number of good deeds that we're supposed to do during the year. That might be more information than you need,
No, I love
but
it.
and we have different foods for Passover, and every family, y'all, has different family culture. So
Yeah.
what I serve might be a little different than what Rachel serves.
My table was similar to Lisa's. I had a brisket and a sweet brisket. My chicken was a little different. It was apricot, though. I had that apricot preserves. I did a lot of vegetables. I didn't do a kugel, and I did rice. Lisa does a traditional dish. It's kasha varnikis, but I do rice instead, which is a very southern thing, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of lovely desserts, apples and honey, of course. It was, yeah, it's always good. I do matzo ball soup. A lot of people traditionally save that for Passover, but
Mm-hmm.
my family loves matzo ball soup. And so I make it for every holiday just because my kids don't come home. They're gone now. But so if they show up, they're getting matzo ball soup when they're
Love
home.
it.
Now, there's one thing that I didn't say that I had, and I start off every Rosh Hashanah luncheon with an appetizer. Sometimes it's plated on the table, but usually I serve it as an appetizer with crackers and vegetables. But I make chopped liver, and only do it once a year, because if you ever make chopped liver, that's all you'll ever want to do is maybe forget about it,
Want to.
and then maybe forget and then come back to it. But my brother-in-laws, they said that's the only reason they come to town is to eat my chopped liver. So, and
Wow.
we had so many, if you could even imagine, I don't know why, we don't know why, but chopped liver is a distinct memory for so many of our contributors. We could have renamed the book uh, Collards and Chopped Liver, but um, and so we really had to pick and choose uh,
Yeah.
chopped liver recipes. Yeah.
That's so
And it's
interesting.
not like people eat chopped liver too much anymore.
No.
They eat it
No.
once a year, maybe.
Yeah, in fact, it's
Yeah.
gotten a negative connotation. What am I,
Mm-hmm.
chopped liver?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you both have already mentioned kugels, so can you tell our listeners, because I had to look it up in your book, like I think it can go sweet or savory. Talk about kugels.
So one of the reasons, honestly, it was kind of the name of the book rolled off my tongue one day, and I just said Knishes, Kugels, and Collars, and then we thought, wait a minute, too much. So then we went back to kugels and collards, and we both make kugel. We both know kugel, but I've never focused on kugel. But lo and behold, I did find a recipe that my grandmother Ida did every Friday night, Sabbath table, and it's one of the very first recipes in the book. It's called Grandma Ida's Kugel, and it is a sweet kugel. But what we came to know is that kugel is an Eastern European kind of comfort food. It would stretch the meal. It would, be an inexpensive way of feeding a big family. And yes, the original kugel was savory. It was probably a potato kugel or a kugel with cheese and milk, like a dairy kugel, maybe not even with the sweet. But we have actually created and know about potato kugels. And then my grandmother Ida's a sweet kugel. And the recipe is not in the book, but we did create. Joan Nathan, actually, who was a guest speaker of ours one year for Kugels and Collards, and we hosted her, and she created a savory kugel, and we've adopted that. It's a Collards kugel, so it's a nice kind of combination.
So it's
Kugels are
potatoey, and it's
traditionally
kind of,
made
would it
with
be in a
egg noodles.
casserole family? Would you call it a casserole?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for saying that. If you were to see a kugel, and when we like to present it, and when we photographed it, it's always in a glass Pyrex. It just seems to be the thing, but it cuts beautifully into squares. And we recently had a book launch in Charleston, and we cut it in little squares and put it in little cookie holders. Pretty little fancy cookie holders. So it's almost like a little, almost could be served as a dessert.
It's
cool.
egg noodles, so you know what the basis is.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Or somebody's referred to it one time as Jewish mac and cheese, except that it has dairy.
I like it already.
Yeah, it's a real comfort food. Yeah, Lisa's grandmother's Kugel is delicious. It's rich and it's creamy, and it has cottage cheese. You can have cottage cheese in it, and sour cream, and dairy. And lots of eggs. It is definitely not dietetic. Okay, so
Yeah,
comfort all
but
the
it
way.
is really good.
Now, Rachel, did you
Totally.
grow up in a kosher home?
I grew up in a small town in South Carolina, about an hour from Columbia. My grandparents, my grandfather was an immigrant from Russia, and he found his way with his brothers to this tiny little town, and they all opened stores. And back in those days, this is the early teens, 20s, 30s, they kept kosher. They raised chickens. They had chickens in their backyard, and they would kosher them, or they'd have the shochet, the person who could kosher them would come by and do it. So growing up there in the 60s and 70s, yeah, our house was not totally kosher, but my dad had grown up with that style. So there was never pork in the house, and no milk and meat together, all of that, no shellfish. I didn't taste a ham sandwich till I was in high school, and it's only because I traded it with a girl who had one. So yeah, it was one of those things that, now, do I keep kosher now? Oh no. I've totally adopted, and we got such good food. I've fallen by the wayside. There's certain things that old habits might be hard to die, which is I don't eat cheeseburgers just because I don't like. I'm not used to it. But shellfish, I'm not a big pork fan, and that's just because I guess I didn't grow up. It's a taste thing. So of course, no pork in the house meant you don't cook your vegetables with pork, right? They were cooked without that type of seasoning. So you would season it with other things.
So that was a question I had as well. So often in the South, we use pork for seasoning vegetables. So
Right.
what would a Southern Jewish cook use to flavor food?
Well, in my family, we just used a little bit of salt and some spices. Now,
Okay.
Lisa uses what do they call it, liquid gold or whatever it is. It's
Small.
chicken schmaltz. It's schmaltz. It's rendered chicken fat.
Okay,
So, which
yeah.
gives you, that kind of flavor. Yeah.
So, yeah, schmaltz is just the Yiddish word for chicken fat. And so I'll go back to my chopped liver. So I always caramelize onions, chop them up real fine, and I throw in just a little bit of renderings off of the fat that I cut off of a chicken breast or a thigh. And I save the chunkier pieces, and I'll tell you what I do with that in a minute. But I take a little bit of that kind of oil from that and cook my onions, and I put that aside. And then what I do is take the chicken fat, it's got a little bit of meat, and I chop it up really fine, and then I put it in the skillet and I cook it down until it's almost like crackling. So, and
Okay.
then when it cools, I can crunch it up. I put a little bit in the chopped liver and a little bit on top. And that's a Yiddish word actually also called gribenes. So, as far as health, the pork fat or the chicken fat, they might cancel each other out, but we never really ever put it in our vegetables. Now, that was a meat dish, but I would never, you know, how Southern. I knew I would visit my neighbors, and I know they would have like a little can by the stove, and it was filled with maybe lard, that they would season um, their vegetables or grease their
Mhm.
skillets with. We didn't grow up that. Our grandmothers and mothers grew up with Fleischmann's margarine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
Which was
love it.
kosher.
Yes, yes,
Kosher.
that's so good. It's sweater weather and soup season, y'all. Laura Beth here to tell you about Zoop. Z-O-U-P. Zoop broths bring flavor to Southern staples like really great grits, while their soups provide a comforting meal. Zoop is available at your favorite retailers across the country, including Instacart and online at walmart.com. For you Amazon shoppers, use promo code 20Magnolias, 20Magnolias, to get 20% off your first purchase on Amazon. Learn more at zoopbroth.com. And now, on with the show. Well, since we're all women here at the table together, I'm so curious to know some of your perspectives on the role of women in Southern Jewish culture.
Well, I would say that if I could go back to my grandmothers, both of them, my maternal and my paternal, these were they were immigrants. They were strong women. They came to this country looking for obviously what immigrants are looking for: religious freedom and a better life, and be able to raise their children. And but they worked. They worked in the stores and they ran the houses, and they cooked. They were and they were amazing women. I mean, both Lisa and I come from a strong line of women that set great examples. They kept kosher homes because they worked. A lot of times, not everybody. I'm going to speak from my own experience. They employed African American women to come in and cook for the family and keep the house and help with the children. And in my own family, my grandmother employed a woman, Ethel Glover, who worked for our family. My father's mother, passed away when my father was in high school. And so Ethel, she taught, basically, before she passed away, she taught Ethel how to keep the kosher kitchen, how not to bring the pork in, and Ethel in turn brought the recipes in from her, the vegetables, fried chicken, how to cook really good rice, all of that. So when my mother married my father, Mama's from Charleston, and moved to this tiny little town in 1955. And I asked her, Mama's 90 now, and I said, could you cook? Because her mother had a store on King Street, and she was not a great cook, quite frankly. I
Right.
mean, that wasn't her thing. And she said, of course I couldn't cook. And I said, well, who fed you? What happened? And she said, well, Ethel, of course, taught my mother how to cook. Ethel knew the Jewish recipes because my grandmother had taught them to her. She
Mhm.
made the kugel, she could make a brisket, the whole thing. And so, I think women hold a huge role, obviously, not just in the kitchen, but in the family and in the overall family, in the direction of that. Um, South Carolina we're not a huge state. And every little town in the turn of the century, and even a little bit before, and until maybe the 70s, 80s, you would find Jewish merchants. So this
Mhm.
was kind of a story that you find. And we have we say a store at every crossroads, and truly, uh, the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina, we've been documenting all of the Jewish merchants throughout the state. And you find this story repeated, particularly in the small towns, of the women in the stores working and raising the children.
Mhm.
They were,
I love it.
quite amazing women, quite
Mhm.
frankly.
We had another agenda that for the book that we really wanted to honor and recognize the African American employed women in the homes that of some of the folks that we interviewed and who contributed stories. It's not across the board, but it seemed to be a similar story for these working women, and they would bring in uh, African American women to help them raise the children and taught them how to create a Jewish kosher kitchen. And these women, honestly, were probably invisible for a while, and even though honored by the family, maybe not honored by our community. And we really wanted to
Mhm.
recognize their contributions and preserve their recipes because they would bring some of their recipes into our homes. One of the stories in the book is my grandmother's uh, uh, employer, Annie Gilliard. And Annie lived side by side in Charleston, next door on St. Philip Street, where many Jewish families and many African American families lived side by side. And the Gilliards happened to live next door to the Fire Tags. That's my mother's uh, parents, my grandparents. And she came over to work for them and, would go next door and raise her children and help raised my grandparents' children, and they'd play in the courtyard in the back. But Annie brought okra gumbo to us. I'm not sure if she took brisket home to her family, the recipe, um, but that is a just kind of a symbol of the local fresh vegetables that in the rural, in South Carolina that we have okra, beans, tomatoes, corn, and many of these vegetables, honestly, were actually brought to America by enslaved and to the South
Mhm.
by enslaved African Americans. And we now benefit from these beautiful dishes, uh, yams, and rice. But Annie's okra gumbo was a told recipe. She was a great cook, but she cooked by taste. But my aunt loved that recipe, and she always said this was Annie's recipe. So it's in the book, Annie Gilliard's okra gumbo, and we were so honored to have, you know, her in our lives and her recipes and her story. And we have some other stories that are similar. But I will tell you this, we dedicated our book to women. So I'm going to read you the dedication. So for the women who came before us and for our children who will continue to tell our Southern Jewish food stories. So we know how important the role of women has been to us and to our Jewish community.
So good. So good. You guys are really, really great examples, really beautiful examples to your entire community and to those that are coming up after you of how to preserve these sorts of traditions and the things that you lived through or the stories that you've heard. I'm just so grateful for this project to exist. And the project is called Kugels and Collards. It's the stories of food, family, and tradition in Jewish South Carolina.
Uh, in 2016, the Historic Columbia gathered a group of us together to talk about how they could document Columbia's Jewish history. And we met and ended up with a fabulous Columbia Jewish Heritage Initiative, where we have stories, oral histories, and walking tours and historic markers, and they've documented Columbia's Jewish history beautifully. Lisa and I had a different direction we wanted to go. We wanted to talk about how memory and food, these food memories, would be a great vehicle to tell your family's history.
Mm-hmm.
And we approached them about that, and they agreed. And the name Kugels and Collards came from Lisa, obviously, Kugels being, as we talked about, the Jewish, and Collards being the Southern. And we started off with a blog. And Historic Columbia's marketing team they were fantastic. And we, would put the blog posts up. We invited friends. We hunted out people who we knew would have the great story. And we did that for several years. And the University of South Carolina Press asked us if we would consider expanding it and maybe taking it to book form. So we wrote a proposal, and they accepted it. And none of this happened too quickly. And the proposal was accepted right about the time the United States went into lockdown for COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So for a couple of years while we were, it was a great project for us to do, because thank goodness for Zoom and emails, and we were able to find people. And I'm the executive director for the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina. So I have this lovely, big, broad base of people across the state and beyond and outside of the state, people who grew up in South Carolina. We were able to send out, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for 600 to 900 words about your family, the best food you've had, a family memory centered around food, or around your mother's best, whatever she made, and all that. So all the stories came in, and we would pursue stories. Lisa did a bunch of Zoom interviews with families who, in some cases, hadn't seen each other because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And so they got on Zoom, and it became a very emotional kind of,
Wow.
enterprise. I mean, they would start talking about family memories and food. And, one thing led to the other. And that's what we found about food. Food is that great vehicle. It brings out such response from people. They can almost smell their grandmother's brisket.
That's right.
Or there's this great story about the family, right? Or you pick up a piece of china and you go, oh my gosh, that was my grandmother's. And then you start talking about grandmama, and then that leads to the next story. So 4 years in the making, the book itself. So 4 years to get this book into print. And, our launch date was August 29th. And we're just really pleased. And, we hope from my standpoint as an executive director of a historical society, this adds to the body of all of the documentation of what we're doing to document South Carolina's Jewish history.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really pleased with that. And we know there's so many more stories to tell. This is just a tiny snapshot of South Carolina. Those stories are out there. We know that. We hope that people will now, maybe this will spark them to sit down with that recorder or pen and paper, whatever they want to use,
Absolutely.
and get that story from their grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
or get that recipe, or get those kids in the kitchen cooking with you and write it down. So many of these recipes were not written down,
Mm-hmm.
and so many of them are trial and error, but they're so important to save and to document. And I think the stories that go along, the recipes are wonderful, but I think it's the stories that
Absolutely.
go along with them that really gives you the depth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Tell us
Right.
where the
And, we
proceeds of this
found
cookbook
that
go as well.
Yeah. So the proceeds, thank you for asking. The proceeds from the book, the royalties go to the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina and to Historic Columbia's Jewish Heritage Initiative. Lisa and I, this has been our volunteer, our love project for these many years. And we've just loved doing it, quite
Yeah.
frankly. And we're just really pleased at the reception we've had from it.
I love that. Well, I'm excited to make the Israeli hummus because Laura Beth and I have huge fond memories of being in Israel and
Mm-hmm.
having fresh hummus and fresh pita, and it's so
Mhm.
different than what you buy store
Yeah.
bought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it is, and
Yeah.
those ingredients are really readily available. We like to think, or I like to think, I'm a therapist and an artist, and Food is a sensory experience. The smells, the taste, the visual presentation, and that evokes very rich emotions. So,
Yes.
like, we said, Rachel, one thing leads to another. And, you don't have to really pay. It just takes one little dish to paint a beautiful memory and evoke people that have passed, people that are not at the table but told a funny story. So either you're laughing or you're crying when you're talking around the table around
Yeah.
food, which makes
Yeah.
us very happy.
That's so fun. I love it. You guys are such kindred spirits with us. I feel like so many of the things that you're saying are things that we've said in relation to food and families and just the passing down. I loved, Lisa, the term you used, told recipe. I've never actually heard it called that, but I knew exactly what you meant. And yeah, it's just a really
Yeah.
important project. Yeah. Do you guys, just shifting a little, have any favorite bakeries or delis in South Carolina that are your go-tos?
Well, Groucho's is our go-to in Columbia,
Okay.
and it was begun by back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, somewhere back there. It's third generation owned now, and so that's actually I think they franchise her around the state.
Okay.
Harold's Cabin in Charleston
Okay.
has reopened, and it's they have a great burger. I don't know if there's so much a deli anymore, but it has a fabulous history. Um, Bakeries, as far as getting good Jewish baked goods here in a bakery doesn't happen. It's mainly home cooks that are
Okay.
baking the rugula and the mandel bread and challah. Lisa's sister Heidi makes fabulous challah,
Mm.
and
You know,
Lisa,
when we talk to people from California, they think that the Jews in the South are kind of a little bit of an anomaly, and they don't they group us with Jews from the North that have readily Jewish foods available to them, but I think because we don't. Perhaps this is why kugels and collards became a thing. We don't have the delis. We don't have the pastrami sandwiches or the fresh bagels or we can't just go to a store and buy kosher meats. I mean, now you can actually get kosher meats, but they're not kosher butchers really around the block anymore like there were for our grandparents. So things are different. But I think that the Jewish foods, which we try to explain traditional foods, are on the table, not enmeshed with the Southern foods, but side by side. So
Mm.
we have our traditional foods along with our rice and greens and okra gumbo. And so it's a beautiful blending and a beautiful table. A lot of Jewish traditional foods are brown. So the southern vegetables are a welcome, addition to our table.
It's so fun.
Well, while I have you two treasures here at my disposal, I have another question that's not food related. I want to know, what are some of your favorite places of importance to the Jewish culture in the American South?
so that's a great question. Wow.
That's a great question.
Um, well, from a historical standpoint, I will say that in South Carolina, in Charleston, KKBE was founded. Well, actually, next year, South Carolina KKBE will celebrate 275 years of communal Jewish life. Kahel Kadosh Beth Elohim. But you can say KKBE if you want to go find it on a website. Sumter, South Carolina has a beautiful synagogue that has now been turned into a museum and is a beautiful example. It was built in like 1912, 1914, and the architecture is stunning as well as the exhibits. And in the Jewish South, there's the Bremen Museum in Atlanta that I have visited. And now in New Orleans, there is the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience.
Yes, we want to go there.
And I have, yeah. Yes, and we do too. Actually, we are very appreciative. They're selling our book in their
Cool.
bookshop right now, so we hope to get down there.
Yeah.
So whenever I travel, that's what I'm seeking out, obviously, because the South has a really interesting Jewish history. I mean, it really is quite fascinating. It's very different than any other part of the country, I think. So I tend to look for beautiful synagogues and the architecture particularly, as well as, hunting out small towns where you might find what was the last vestige of Jewish life there. You may see a storefront and maybe it's become something else, but sometimes you'll find the original name, still in the tile work, and it might have been a Jewish merchant in that community. So, yeah, Lisa, you got anything else you want to add?
Charleston at one time, girls, had more Jewish people who came to America than New York City. Charleston was a welcoming city, and the Sephardic or Mediterranean Jews came to Charleston in the starting the 1600s to the 1700s, and built a beautiful and beautiful community here, and a strong community. Now, over time, of course, that gave way to the northern cities and the larger cities in the north, and so the population of Jews diminished. But their work and their community lived, and there is the synagogue that Rachel is talking about is really celebrated and has a beautiful gift shop, which I like. And Charleston does Jewish tours, walking tours, as well as Columbia. Historic Columbia does a tour of the merchants on Main Street and Assembly Street, and still talks about the where and how the Jewish merchants came to Columbia. So you can find a little Jewish history in the smallest part of South Carolina to the capital of South Carolina.
We also document cemeteries as well. Our cemeteries are well documented on the Jewish Historical Society website. Cumming Street Cemetery in Charleston is one of the oldest, with graves dating back to the beginning times of Charleston Jewish communal life. And they do tours of that as well. So, yeah. So, it's interesting. We have our history.
Wow.
It's here.
Wow.
And documented. Yeah, that's what we do all the time. We're working to continue to document it. Kugels and collars just adds to that.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes. Well, ladies, keep up the great work. We are so grateful for all the volunteer hours that you're putting in. And again, the book is called Kugels and Collards. We're going to link to it in our show notes so that you guys can easily find it. But again, can't thank you enough for your time. And I feel like we should say shalom.
Shalom.
Oh, shalom, y'all. Well, that was delightful. Thank you, girls.
Y'all are wonderful.
Well,
Yeah.
are you?
I know.
Let's meet in New Orleans.
Good. No, great question.